All right, with this lecture, we switch gears a little bit. We start to look at topics in cognitive science. We start to learn things that we've come to understand, at least partially, about our brain and how we cognize the world. However, we're not going to leave behind the sorts of themes that we have developed over the past few weeks. We're going to start our discussion of vision going back really basically to the 70s, late 70s and early 80s. We're going to look at David Marr and the contribution that Marr made to early vision research. And we're going to have two sorts of goals in mind. One, we're going to start to understand how our visual system works, at least as we understand it now. But secondly, we're going to look at the way our understanding of the visual system evolved, how it was that the way we understood and characterized the phenomenon changed, and how our understanding of how to go about a computational explanation of cognitive phenomenon changed as well. So we're going to start off, we'll talk a little bit about David Marr himself. We'll talk about how Marr understood the previous approach to visual research, the difficulties that he thought this combination of understanding vision through psychophysics and neurophysiology led to. And first, we'll look at the problem that descriptive theories, they give us an understanding of how particular components of the visual system work. Ultimately, they can't provide us with a complete understanding of what vision is and how the visual system pulls off that feat. It gives us limited insight into the very problem of what vision is, and limited insight into how the brain solves that problem. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll talk then about Marr's response. Marr argued that in order to understand a cognitive task like vision, we really had to break that task into three different kinds of analyses, three different levels. He introduced these three notions of a computational level, a representations and algorithms level, and an implementation level. And he thought that understanding and explaining a cognitive task and our ability to perform that cognitive task involved articulating that task using these three different levels of analysis, and then integrating our understanding of how those three different levels of analysis worked in an individual cognizer. And we'll talk about Marr's standard characterization of vision. So we're going to see both a change in the methodology for approaching computational explanations that Marr introduces into theories of vision. We're also going to see how Marr starts off essentially with a kind of pre-theoretic or folk-influenced understanding of what we do when we engage in visual vision. And we'll finish this lecture by looking at the first of three ways that it looks like Marr mischaracterized vision. All right? So he made tremendous strides forward, and yet at the same time, he didn't solve every problem. So there's this continuing evolution. There's a dynamic nature, even to this relatively advanced understanding that we have of this particular information processing capacity. So the first thing that we'll talk about at the end of this lecture is that Marr had a view of a single processing stream producing a single representation at the end, the visual scene as represented with useful information for all our visually oriented tasks. It looks like this was horribly, horribly wrong, that vision, in fact, just in terms of spatial mapping, the understanding of the visual scene in spatial terms, vision contributes to three different kinds of spatial maps. And so we'll talk about each of those kinds of spatial maps and how they figure into our visually guided cognitive performance of various tasks. The second thing that we'll look at in the next lecture is that vision actually isn't a single process at all, but that vision, as we experience it, is really the integration of multiple processing streams. So we'll look at the processing stream that specializes in motion perception and generation, sometimes called the what and how pathway. And we'll look at the visual processing stream that specializes in fine pattern, color, and object recognition, sometimes referred to as the what processing stream. And then we'll go even farther and look at what has been discovered even more recently, namely that a huge part of perceptual processing actually involves resource optimization, trying to use our limited resources in a way that gives us the best result for our multiple visual processing tasks. And this involves juggling around, as we'll see in later lectures. So David Marr was born in 1945 and he died in 1980. He received his BA in mathematics in 1966 from Cambridge and his PhD in physiology in 1972. He was a very, very intelligent person. He joined the psychology faculty at MIT in 1977, and he was promoted to full professor in 1980. Sadly, that same year, he died of leukemia at the age of 35. His book, Vision, A Computational Investigation into the Human Representation and Processing of Visual Information, was published posthumously in 1982, and that's the Marr reading that you're looking at from the syllabus. So one of the things that Marr thought was that visual research was stalling out, and it was stalling out in part because of the way in which many researchers were approaching trying to understand how vision worked. And so one approach to visual understanding just involves carefully determining what each of the components of the visual system does, what it represents, say using psychophysics and the connected use of neurophysiology. So you differentiate types of cells and types of structures in the visual processing array, and then you determine what their exact functions are. Now, while such approaches had led to a great deal of understanding, for instance, they allowed us to understand that there were multiple types of light-sensitive cells in the back of the eye, rods, and 3 different types of cones, right? They helped us understand how they were sensitive to different wavelengths of light, and so on. However, while they did help us to understand these things, they didn't help us to understand everything, right? Our understanding of psychophysics and neurophysiology didn't help us to understand, for example, why it was that the fovea here, this area right at the back of the retina, right, had this enormously high concentration of cones, the cells that are prominent in color processing, and that it tapers off dramatically once you leave this very narrow area right around the fovea. And that rods, which are the light and dark, larger photosensitive cells that don't figure prominently in color processing, how they are almost non-existent in the fovea and then increase dramatically in their concentration as you move out from the fovea. There's no real explanation for why that is, just on the basis of the sorts of light that they're sensitive to, the range of their sensitivities, and so on. And Marr saw there a problem with how some visual researchers were trying to understand vision.